Hebrews 9. I'm going to read the entirety of that chapter to start us off this morning. Now, the first covenant had regulations for worship and also an earthly sanctuary. A tabernacle was set up, and its first room were the lampstand and the table with its consecrated bread. This was called the holy place. Behind the second curtain, a room called the most holy place, which had the golden altar of incense, the gold-covered ark of the covenant. This ark contained the gold jar of manna, Aaron's staff that had budded, and the stone tablets of the covenant. Above the ark were the cherubim of the glory, overshadowing the atonement cover. But we cannot discuss these things in detail now. When everything had been arranged like this, the priests entered regularly into the outer room to carry on their ministry. But only the high priest entered the inner room, and that only once a year, and never without blood, which he offered for himself and for the sins the people had committed in ignorance. The Holy Spirit was showing by this that the way into the most holy place had not yet been disclosed, as long as the first tabernacle was still functioning. This is an illustration for the present time, indicating that the gifts and sacrifices being offered were not able to clear the conscience of the worshiper. They are only a matter of food and drink and various ceremonial washings, external regulations applying until the time of the new order. But when Christ came as high priest of the good things that are now already here, he went through the greater and more perfect tabernacle that is not made with human hands. That is to say, is not a part of this creation. He did not enter by means of the blood of goats and calves, but he entered the most holy place once for all by his blood, thus obtaining eternal redemption. The blood of goats and bulls, the ashes of a heifer sprinkled on those who are ceremonial unclean, sanctify them so that they are outwardly clean. How much more then will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our consciences from acts that lead to death, so that we may serve the living God? For this reason, Christ is the mediator of a new covenant, that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance. Now that he has died as a ransom to set them free from the sins committed under the first covenant. In the case of a will, it is necessary to prove the death of the one who made it, because a will is in force only when somebody has died. It never takes effect while the one who made it is living. This is why even the first covenant was not put into effect without blood. When Moses had proclaimed every command of the law to all the people, he took the blood of calves together with water, scarlet wool, and branches of hyssop, and sprinkled the scroll and all the people. He said, "This is the blood of the covenant which God has commanded you to keep." In the same way, he sprinkled with the blood both the tabernacle and everything used in its ceremonies. In fact, the law requires that nearly everything be cleansed with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. It was necessary then for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these sacrifices, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Christ did not enter a sanctuary made with human hands. That was only a copy of the true one. He entered heaven itself, now to appear for us in God's presence. Nor did he enter heaven to offer himself again and again, the way the high priest enters the most holy place every year with blood that is not his own. Otherwise, Christ would have had to suffer many times since the creation of the world. But he has appeared once for all at the culmination of the ages to do away with sin by the sacrifice of himself. Just as people are destined to die once and after that face judgment, so Christ was sacrificed once to take away the sins of many, and he will appear a second time, not to bear sin, but to bring salvation to those who are waiting for him. A few weeks ago, my son and his friend, one of our neighbors, came to me and asked, "Dad, we have," well, the one who's not my son didn't call me Dad, but my son said, "Dad, we have these throwable paintballs. Can we use them outside?" I said, "Sure. Do not come inside again until you are clean." And I think I said it probably 20 times. Don't touch the door until you are clean. Don't walk in the house until you are clean. Of course, I believe the door was open so that I could be asked, how do I get clean before coming in the house? I think there was a hose involved, and now there's lots of blue, supposedly biodegradable paint all over the back of my house. We are accustomed to not wanting people to come into places when they are dirty. We don't want them to track mud into the house, so we take off our shoes at the door. I think most children can relate to that moment when they had so much fun that their mom needed to spray them down with a hose before allowing them to come back into the house. And here in this account, we see an illustration of this. We see this really applied to eternity, applied to the dwelling place of God. That there is a dirtiness that does not belong with Him. There is this call by God that we not track mud into His house, but we are coated in mud. We are coated in dirt. In fact, the Old Testament sacrificial system largely served to illustrate that. It here in our text today describes the tabernacle. It doesn't describe everything about the tabernacle, but it highlights some of the key points about the tabernacle. And there was an increasing level of holiness the farther you went into the tabernacle. An increasing expectation for those who are making entrance into the tabernacle, the farther in you would get. So even outside the tabernacle, you had the camp of Israel. Everyone in Israel is a part of that camp. But there are some who are excluded from the camp because they become unclean. So they get sent out for a time and eventually they can come back in. Even beyond that, you have the Gentiles who are excluded from the people of Israel. Then as you get closer, you have the outer area of the tabernacle. You have the holy place and the most holy place. And that whole process is creating distance between God and His people. Their system included these somewhat weird purity laws. You read in Leviticus and you read in Deuteronomy, you see these conversations about how to handle open sores. And you're just like, really? That's what you're worried about? Like that people don't come to the temple with sores? That seems like an unusual thing to emphasize. But the whole point is showing that mankind is alienated from God and God must make a way for them to enter. And He does so through this sacrificial system. And as He describes the tabernacle here, He's not describing something ugly. He's not describing something evil and awful and bad. He's actually describing something beautiful and good, a product of His grace. When mankind is alienated from God, God does not content Himself to leave them in their alienation, but He makes a way for them to be restored, for them to be reconciled, for them to have access. And so this old way illustrates both God's holiness, which separates Him from sinful man, from impure man, and God's grace, which offers access to Him through the sacrificial system. And it describes God's holiness with this beautiful picture of a tabernacle. And then it talks about the special access they had when everything was arranged like this. The priests entered regularly into the outer room, but the high priest entered the inner room once a year, never without blood, which he offered for himself and for the sins of the people that the people had committed in ignorance. So there's a but to this temple. It offers reconciliation and access, but it also emphasizes distance. Only one person in the entire nation of Israel could enter into that into that most holy place in the tabernacle. Only one. Not everyone, only one. And he couldn't do it every day. He only did it once a year. And he couldn't do it however he wanted. There was this long, exhausting process that he had to go through. The clothes he was supposed to wear, the laundry he was supposed to do, everything about him had to be prepared to access this. And so it illustrates that distance. And those illustrations serve to tell us that this method, this tabernacle, this way of reconciliation provided does not ultimately provide final reconciliation. Verse number 9 says, "This is an illustration for the present time, indicated that the gifts and sacrifices being offered were not able to clear the conscience of the worshiper." Couldn't clear what was happening inside. It could not deal with the heart of those worshipers. It was external. It was symbolic. It was anticipating something that had to happen because God's people were rebels at their very core. It wasn't just the things they did. It was the things they thought, the things they believed, the things they felt. It was who they were that was alienated from God. And all of this external symbolism could only point forward. It could not ultimately deal with their problem. It did not clear their conscience. Have you ever gotten mold in your bathroom? Are you supposed to just paint over it with normal paint so that no one can see it? No, because what happens? It's still there. It still grows. It still festers. It still expands. You have to actually deal with the problem at its root. Similarly, the Old Testament system was largely painting over corruption. It was painting over corruption with an anticipation that something better would happen, but it wasn't dealing with the very heart. The old tabernacle was a good and gracious gift from God, but it left its recipients wanting, waiting for something. But Jesus offers something better. Verse number 11. "But when Christ came, something changed. Something was different. The inadequacies of that old system, though it was good, the inadequacies are satisfied by Christ. He overcomes those inadequacies. It's our tendency to look at books like Hebrews that talk about that Old Testament system and think of the Old Testament system as something bad. Like the law is bad. The law is evil. We need to be delivered from the law. And we do need to be delivered from the law, but not because it's bad, because it's partial, because it's incomplete, because it's inadequate. Jesus' greatness doesn't mean the law is bad. He is just so much better than even this precious gift that God gave to his people. Jesus is better. When Christ came as high priest of the good things that are now already here, he went through the greater and more perfect tabernacle that is not made with human hands, that is to say, is not part of this creation. He did not enter by means of blood and of goats and calves, but he entered the most holy place once for all by his own blood, thus obtaining eternal redemption. Jesus' greater way includes, first of all, a better tabernacle. A better tabernacle. This earthly tabernacle was beautiful. It was good. But where is it now? Can you find it? Can you go there? Can you see the work of these artisans from the Old Testament? No, it's gone. It was temporary in multiple senses of the word. Temporary in that it anticipated something, but also temporary in the sense that it was made of things that pass away, things that rot, things that fall apart. But Jesus is a high priest in a better tabernacle. Consider also the tabernacle in the Old Testament needed to be specifically indwelt by the presence of God. You see that described in Exodus 40. After the completion of the tabernacle, verse 34 says this, "Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. When Ezra reconstructs the temple, we don't see that same thing talked about. When we see Jesus going to the temple, we don't really get this sense that this is what's happening at the temple in Jesus' time. The presence of the Lord inhabited that tabernacle in a unique way. It wasn't a permanent reality. We can't look it up on Google Maps and see a picture of where it is today. It was temporary. But Jesus is a high priest in a better tabernacle. One that's not a symbol of something greater, but is the thing symbolized, is the greater thing. One that lasts forever, that's not made with hands, that will not rot, that will not be corrupted, that will not be destroyed. Jesus has made entrance into a more perfect tabernacle. His offering is better. What he gives to us is better than the law. But then consider, if Jesus is a minister in a better tabernacle, and the old tabernacle that was lesser had restricted access, how much more restricted must the access be to the better tabernacle? You see, he's given us something better. Do you think that with making something better, more holy, more permanent, more exalted, farther away from us, not built with our hands, and making that something better, does it get easier to gain access? Does that make any sense? Can more than just the high priest gain access to this better tabernacle when they couldn't to the lesser tabernacle? Can we access without bringing a dead goat with us and its blood with us? It's a better tabernacle. Well, access to the better tabernacle is, in a way, more restricted because no blood of a goat will get you there. But in another way, it is more open because a better offering has been made. Second, we see this better offering, verses 13 through 22. The blood of goats and bulls, the ashes of a heifer sprinkled on those who are ceremonially unclean, sanctify them so that they are outwardly clean. How much more then will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our consciences from acts that lead to death so that we may serve the living God? For this reason, Christ is the mediator of a new covenant, that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, now that he has died as a ransom to set them free from the sins committed under the first covenant. In the case of a will, it is necessary to prove the death of the one who made it, because a will is in force only when someone has died. It never takes effect while the one who made it is living. This is why even the first covenant was not put into effect without blood. When Moses had proclaimed every command of the law to all the people, he took the blood of calves together with water, scarlet wool, the branches of hyssop, and sprinkled the scroll and all the people. He said, "This is the blood of the covenant which God has commanded you to keep." In the same way, he sprinkled with blood both the tabernacle and everything used in its ceremonies. In fact, the law requires that nearly everything be cleansed with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. There was this expectation in the old system that blood must be shed to offer cleansing. That symbolism is different than how we think of blood. Blood is something we clean up. But in the biblical imagery, it is something that purifies, something that cleanses. Jesus comes making a cleansing sacrifice, as was expected in the Old Testament. He sheds his blood, as was expected in the Old Testament, but he offers more because he sheds his own blood, the blood of the God-man. The perfect Lamb of God is shed. Consider the inadequacy of the Old Testament sacrificial system. Go all the way back to Genesis chapter 9. After the flood, God institutes a law. He says that if a man sheds a man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. God establishes right at the beginning of the post-flood world this idea that blood, the life, pays for life. It's an idea that gets carried through and a payment being made in the sacrificial system. Yet we recognize that what Genesis 9 is trying to establish is a fundamental concept of fairness, life for life. But then we get to the sacrificial system and it's goat's life for man's life. It's an uneven trade. Right? How could a dead animal possibly pay the price that was warranted? Now imagine you're in a court system today. You're in a place where capital punishment is the law of the land. And the judge, after the jury finds the defendant guilty, says, I sentence him to death. But that's really harsh, so here's a goat. We're going to kill that instead. Your views on capital punishment aside, we would recognize that makes no sense as a substitute. A goat does not take the place of a man. Yet, in Jesus, the sacrifice is adequate. Now, if my blood was shed to pay my price, that's enough. It's not even enough for me, because I'm still dead. But when Jesus sheds his blood, he conquers death, he defeats the grave, he lives again, and he pays the price for all who will believe in him. He pays the price with blood that is of surpassing worth. Our sin wrongs God. The price he demands cannot be satisfied except for by the perfect Lamb of God who satisfies it for all who will come. God was gracious in instituting an Old Testament system that covered for a time the sins of his people. But it was always looking forward to something because a goat was never going to be enough. And so Christ dies to make an offering, to cleanse, to satisfy God's demands. In the new covenant, death isn't symbolized, it's actualized. In the Old Testament, that shedding of blood symbolized the death of the people who had sinned. But in Jesus, there is actual death of a man, but a man who's not just a man who is the God-man, holy and righteous and able to satisfy the demands of God. And so, this new covenant is based on greater promises and offers greater blessings and a better tabernacle through a better sacrifice. And as a result, our consciences are cleansed. The inside of us, our hearts, the things that people can't see, the things that the blood of goats and rams could not cleanse, they are cleansed through the blood of Jesus. And access is provided into the better tabernacle, heaven itself, the permanent dwelling place of God. Not a symbol, not a representation, not an anticipation, but the actual presence of God. We get to go there because the offering of a better sacrifice. And so finally, we see that our better priest offers us a better salvation, a better tabernacle, a better sacrifice, a better salvation. Verse 25. Nor did he enter heaven to offer himself again and again the way the high priest enters the most holy place every year with blood that is not his own. Otherwise, Christ would have had to suffer many times since the creation of the world. But he has appeared once for all at the culmination of ages to do away with sin by the sacrifice of himself. Just as people are destined to die once and after that to face judgment, so Christ was sacrificed once to take away the sins of many. And he will appear a second time not to bear sin, but to bring salvation to those who are waiting for him. The Old Testament system anticipated Jesus coming and bringing a better sacrifice, a once-for-all sacrifice, one that would not need to be repeated for all of eternity. And Jesus offers that sacrifice and provides eternal salvation. But this text still has us living in anticipation. But we're not anticipating the sacrifice being offered again. That's already taken care of once for all. It's settled. It's taken care of. But we are anticipating the return of Christ, not to bear sin, but to bring salvation. And so we wait. We anticipate and we long for our Messiah, our King, our sacrifice. Sacrifice given in a better tabernacle to offer better promises to us. The author of Hebrews writes to this church that's facing persecution, that's facing temptation. And like so many of us, they believe in Jesus, but he seems far away. He seems like he is not here. The world in which we live seems like he is not always ruling over. We are not like Thomas, getting to see the nail prints in his hands. We are not like the disciples, able to touch him, to see him. And so we feel as if he is far off. And this church in the book of Hebrews was in that same situation. And so the author of Hebrews repeatedly, over and over again, from different angles, continues to exalt for that people the greatness of Jesus. He is better than everything else. He is even better than that beautiful Old Testament tabernacle and the system of sacrifice that offered reconciliation for a time for his people. Jesus is better than that. And the author of Hebrews, like a diamond, holds up Jesus and turns him around in the light and allows us to see it from different angles. And so we see him talking about him being a better priest. We see him in a better tabernacle, a better sacrifice, a better salvation. He is better, 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 better. And every week that we go through this series, we come back and it boils down to the very same message. Jesus is better. Better than what? Everything. And he offers to us permanent cleansing through his once-for-all sacrifice. And here we see it put in front of us again. Some here may not know Jesus. You may be trying to be your own sacrifice, be good enough. You try and cleanse your conscience by doing better. You try and cleanse your conscience by dulling it and convincing yourself that the things you know you ought not do are not actually that bad after all. You try and deal with it by just being a good person, by doing some sort of external things. Maybe it's going to church. Maybe it's giving money to charity or giving money to the church. Maybe it's being a good dad, a good husband, a good wife, a good mother, a good son, a good daughter. You do these things, but Jesus is better than all of the things that you want to offer to God. All the things that you want to offer to cleanse yourself, they will not get you access to him because he's given you something better that does. So look to Jesus. Christians, those who are believers in Jesus, keep on looking to Jesus. Keep on holding on to him because he offers us something better. And so this book is written to those who are still anticipating something else. But it's Jesus culminating the salvation he has already provided on the cross. He will return, not to bear sin, but to bring salvation to those who are waiting for him. And so we wait for him. We don't just wait arbitrarily. We wait specifically for something. We wait for him. We wait for him to come back. And that is hard. And it gets long. And we get sick of waiting. We don't want to wait anymore. But he is coming again. And in recognition of that, he calls us to do some things that remind us, that help us to wait. This time I'll ask our music team to come forward. We're about to observe the Lord's Supper. It's one of those things that the Lord provides to us to help us wait, to help us anticipate his return. He gives us other things. The temple of the Lord today is not this tabernacle, but it is his people where he dwells. So we gather together, helps us anticipate his coming. It helps us hold on to him. It helps us rest in him. But this morning, in addition to that, we will eat. We will taste something. We will put something physical in our bodies to remember that our God, eternal spirit, became a man, took on flesh, and dwelt among us, that his body was hung on a cross, his hands were pierced, his blood was shed. And we remind ourselves of that. We're going to take a few moments to prepare our hearts through singing together of his great sacrifice.